unintelligible. Up to this juncture, there is nothing particularly unique about Dara Shikoh's investigations. His frustration with the enigmas of the Quran and even biblical texts echoes the quiet grouses of generations of Muslim scholars before him. It is this next step, the one that I'm now going to be talking about, that will push him towards the outer edges of permissible inquiry among Muslims. Dara Shikoh continues by wondering why discussions of monotheism were so widespread in India. His curiosity piqued. The prince says he began to examine the heavenly books, Kutub-e Asmani, of this ancient nation, Qaum-e-Qadim. What followed was a startling discovery, according to him. The Vedas were in fact revealed to the Hindus' greatest prophet, Brahma, who, Dara Shikoh asserts, is none other than the prophet Adam by a different name. Now, Dara Shikoh was not the first Muslim scholar to wonder whether the Vedas might be viewed as the Quran or Bible of the ancient Hindus. Others had done this as well. But it is the prince's association of Brahma with Adam, however, that proved especially controversial. In so doing, he seemed to not only be claiming that the Upanishads represented an earlier source for monotheism, just as the Bible is earlier than the Quran, but also that certain Hindu texts might serve as a commentary, a tafsir, on all monotheistic religious texts, not only the Quran. Thus, the Vedas had not been entirely superseded by later, more inspired religious texts. Rather, according to Dara, they retained some original insights that were lost in the later texts. And it was these rather radical claims that earned Dara Shikoh great infamy. Dara Shikoh attached great significance to his discovery of the Upanishads' monotheistic character. Besides arguing that he had uncovered a deliberate plot spanning centuries to, and I quote him here, conceal and hide the Upanishads from Muslims, whom he calls Ahl-e-Islam, Dara Shikoh also claimed that he had finally found answers to all the questions that had forced him to look beyond the Quran and biblical texts in the first place. Dara Shikoh is wholly convinced that these first heavenly books, Awwalin Kutub-e Samawi, are not only the spring and source of inquiry of the ocean of divine oneness, but more crucially that they conform with and provide commentary for the Quran. With this judgment, one that raises serious doubts about the Quran's perfection and Islam's complete self-sufficiency in relation to all preceding religions, Dara Shikoh conclusively overstepped the bounds of accepted Islamic dogma. Clearly anticipating an attack as a heretic or an apostate, Dara Shikoh's introduction offers a scattered but extremely vigorous three-part defense of his claims. These claims are exclusively geared to the Muslim community. The first element in his defense is a blistering attack on the Muslim ulama, the Sunni Muslim ulama, I should add. He mocks the ulama's claims to knowledge and learning. Dara Shikoh characterizes these men as the, and I quote him here, uninformed of this age, the jahlai in waqt. By using the plural form of jahil, ignorant, barbarian, unbeliever, Dara Shikoh deliberately equates the ulama to the pre-Islamic Arabs who are derided in Muslim historical and religious accounts as living in the lowest state of civilization. Like the jahils of yore, the ulama of today, this is Dara Shikoh, are also engaged in unbelief by virtue of their willful rejection, their inkar, of non-Islamic Indian monotheists, Muwahidan. The implications of this line of argument are clear. Given that the ulama lack religious credibility, how can they stand in judgment over Dara Shikoh's own religious inquiries? This is the first part of his defense. We move to the second part now. An attempt to clarify Dara Shikoh's interpretive reasoning forms the second part of his self-defense. The prince explains that his inspiration to take a serious look at the Upanishads came from no less a source than the Quran itself. He cites verses from the Quran that proclaim that every community, everywhere and throughout history, has at one point or another received divine guidance to put it on the right track. Dara Shikoh offers additional citation from the Quran, specifically cites Surah Al-Waqi'ah, to support his more conspiratorial claim that the Upanishads are not only God's first monotheistic text, but in fact the spring from which all subsequent discussions about divine oneness flow. He notes Surah Al-Waqi'ah's reference to a quote-unquote hidden or protected book, Kitab Maknoon, that has already been revealed by God. He claims, although never offers us any corroboration or evidence, that actual verses or ayats in the Quran are also found in this ancient book. The final defense Dara Shikoh offers to support his claims is of God's own approval. Specifically, Dara Shikoh refers to a divination from Surah Al-Araf that he received when he first commenced his translation of the Upanishads. And this is a quotation by Dara Shikoh, and of course he's quoting the surah here. A book revealed unto thee, so let thy heart be oppressed no more by any difficulty on that account, that with it thou mightst warn the erring and teach the believers. Although this Quranic verse refers to the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran, the implied connection to Dara Shikoh's own revelation and his appointment by God to lead humanity to salvation, to the first monotheistic text, is noteworthy. So what are the implications of the prince's revelation of this great secret, the Sir Akbar? To my mind, there are at least two very important implications involved here. First, Dara Shikoh's treatment of the Upanishads as an Islamic scripture seems aimed at denying parts of small h Hinduism and independent religious bases outside of an Islamic theological framework. Second, conversion to Islam ultimately seems the only logical and rational choice for certain communities of Hindus, given that Indian monotheists, Muwahidan, that's the word he uses, and realizers of the truth, Muhaqqiqan, were in fact responsible for much of the Hindu corpus, which in turn has now been abrogated by the Quran. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are hardly the hallmarks of, to use a very famous scholar of Dara Shikoh, a gentleman by the name of K.R. Kanungo, an apostle of Hindu-Muslim understanding. And yet they also do not indicate the mindset of a person for whom Islam no longer holds either spiritual or intellectual relevance. If anything, the Sir Akbar, with its attempts to locate a distinct religious tradition squarely within the Islamic framework, suggests an attempt by Dara Shikoh to privilege an expansive Islamic terrain. Now, how did contemporary Hindus and Muslims react to Dara Shikoh and his intellectual endeavors? Surprise of surprises, many Hindus reacted to Dara's projects with deep skepticism. They were very troubled by some of the work that he was engaged in. Even as some saw the prince's work as lacking in depth, others must have undoubtedly feared the implied suggestion that Hindus, in fact, were Muslims. Although dissent against the prince was muted, it was not entirely absent, as seen in the Hindu holy man, Baba Lal Viragi's cautionary stances, extremely cautionary stances, during recorded conversations with Dara Shikoh that have survived to this day. Or the suggestion by Raja Jai Singh, the highest-ranking Mughal nobleman during Shah Jahan's reign, that the prince was dabbling with subjects that he did not understand. Although the Muslim religious establishment, like its Hindu counterpart, generally adopted a similarly cautious public attitude vis-à-vis this powerful prince, here too we find a strong undertow of opposition. This is not only apparent from the open warnings by Sufi luminaries like Sheikh Muhibullah Allahabadi and Lisanullah Rustaqi that Dara Shikoh's understanding of the Quran is imperfect, but more importantly, the public and vicious attacks upon the intellectual associates of Dara Shikoh, men like Mullah Shah Badakhshi, Sheikh Bari, and the Jew/Muslim Sarmad. Clearly, Dara Shikoh was very perturbed by these attacks. And yet, instead of trying to reassure and reconcile his opponents, the prince proceeded to antagonize them even further by fighting back on multiple fronts. In this regard, consider Dara Shikoh's deteriorating relationship with the Muslim religious establishment through the 1650s. Besides continuing efforts to prove, as seen in his 1654 work, Hasanatul Arifin, or Aphorisms of the Saints, that his ideas were mainstream and could be corroborated by the sayings of dozens of respected Islamic religious figures and saints, Dara nonetheless accuses certain unnamed alims of being sordid and abject fellows. He next proceeds to dismiss others, here the ulama, as dry, insipid, and bigoted persons, who are not only kuta bini, narrow in outlook, but also dajjals themselves, or imposters, the antichrist, call them what you want. In fact, Dara argues that if anyone is guilty of ta'in wa inkar, heresy and rejection, it is them, the ulama, not himself. These attacks will be followed by others, including the appearance of stinging verses of disapproval in his divan, verses like the one that I'm just going to quote. I'll give you the English translation in a second. Bihisht an ja ki mullai na bashad. Az mullai shor wa ghughai na bashad. Jahan khali shod az shor-e mulla, az fatwa hayesh parwai na bashad. Dar an shehri ki mulla khune darad, dar an ja hich danai na bashad. Paradise is there where no mullah abides, where the mullah's argument and tumult do not reside. May the world become free from the noise of the mullah. May no one pay heed to his fatwa. In the city where a mullah resides, no wise man ever abides. Despite Dara Shikoh's obvious anger, we would be remiss to imagine, as most scholars have, that such verses are part of the good fight against orthodoxy